Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 14. March to April 1916. Rouse came back to the barracks that evening, stowing his kit at Kenyon's old bunk. If he minded his demotion, Thomas couldn't tell. At the first question, he tearfully told the story of his capture. He'd been caught, as Thomas had guessed, after he took the new X-ray films of Kingston's leg, but before he'd had a chance to examine them. He'd also made no attempt to deny what he was doing or why. Knowing him, Thomas wasn't surprised. Major Winthrop, as the M.O. in charge of Kingston's case, had been rousted out of bed to deal with the situation. "He wouldn't even look at the fucking films," Rouse said. "Well, let me look at them, bloody bastard. Spent the rest of the night in the guardhouse, and then first thing in the morning they had me in front of a board. It was fucking rigged. They wouldn't look at the films either, barely let me get a word in." "Was it awful being on FP?" someone asked. "Nah, easier than working. It was only when they had poor Kingston going back and forth in front of me that I was fussed about it. That were proper cruel." A few days later, Kingston was sent on a convoy back to the base hospitals. Probably, Rouse heard from one of the surgeons bound from there to Blighty, where he'd need at least one more operation if he was to walk again. The same night, Theo left on a convoy heading in the opposite direction. Thomas went to the ward before dinner, taking him a spare pair of socks and a couple of packs of cigarettes. "Here," he said, handing them to him. "Thanks." Theo was dressed in his uniform, sergeant's stripes and all. It looked good on him, Thomas thought, but it didn't suit him. Theo liked soft clothes when he wasn't in livery. He put the cigarettes in his tunic pockets and the socks in his pack. "Just what I needed," he said, refastening the straps of his pack. "I'm meeting up with my regiment in rest camp," they said. "So that'll be good. Get a few days to adjust before we go back up." "Good," said Thomas. "What about you? Do you know yet when you're going to be back to your regular outfit?" For a moment, Thomas wondered if Theo had forgotten that he wasn't a patient here. Then he remembered that the section had been seconded here for the winter, and now it was nearly spring. He hadn't really thought about the fact that they'd be going back to the 47th. Back when they first came, it had seemed so distant as to be barely worth noticing. No, they haven't said. He could, he realized, write to Jessup and ask. The wardmaster might know what the plan was. Theo looked around. His bed was in the middle of the ward, and all around them were other patients, some packing for one or another of the convoys leaving tonight. "I feel like a walk. You busy?" He wanted to talk without being overheard, he meant. "I'm free till dinner." They went outside and wandered up towards the half-finished new wards. "I'm glad I met your friends," Theo said. "Do me a favor and, don't push them away, all right?" Thomas's first impulse was to deny that he had any idea who Theo was talking about. He suppressed it. "I mean it," Theo added. "Nobody should be alone in this place, and they're good chaps, both of them." He bumped his shoulder against Thomas's. "Rollins is cute as hell, too." Thomas shot him a look. "I don't think so." "No, really," Theo agreed. "But it'll do school my stuff if it was you asking. Especially once you're back up where there's no girls. Good excuse." Thomas let himself for a moment think about Rollins that way. He probably would, now that Theo mentioned it. He always followed Thomas's lead. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Maybe not," Theo admitted. "Could be fun, though." He went on. "Now, Rouse, had you caught on to him yet?" Theo shook his head. "You think? Peter thought so too." "He told me," Theo said, "one night when I couldn't sleep." "You didn't tell him?" "No," Theo said. "We weren't talking about you." He tilted his head to one side. "I said talking." "Really?" said Thomas. "Where?" "Not in the middle of the ward, surely." "That little room where they watch the chamber pots," Theo said. "Not the most romantic spot." He went on. "I don't think you're his type, and I know he's not yours. But that could be fun, too." "I'm not really looking for fun," Thomas said. Theo gave him a sidelong look. "Has there been anybody since Peter?" "No." "I don't think he'd mind. I mean, it isn't disloyal." "It's not that," Thomas said. "I just don't want to." "Don't then," Theo said with a shrug. "But you still need friends." Thomas thought of Rollins pressing up against his side when they sat on the barracks step smoking in the cold. "Yeah, all right." The nurses, Thomas knew, were in the habit of lining up outside the administration building to wave the convoys off when they were headed to the front. A few men usually joined them, but Thomas never had. He felt a bit conspicuous standing there for Theo's convoy. He felt even more conspicuous when Theo, standing in line to have his name checked off a list, broke away from the group. There were a few catcalls from men who assumed he was heading for one of the nurses. He hugged Thomas tightly and said into his ear, "Be all right. Please be all right." Thomas awkwardly patted his shoulder. "You too." Once the convoy had gone, he walked back to the barracks and sat on the steps. It was a warm evening, spring coming early, but he wrapped his greatcoat tightly around himself, holding it closed with his free hand while he smoked. He was not entirely surprised when Rouse and Rawlins came out, Rawlins crowding onto the step with him, Rouse taking the one above. "You're making off all right?" Rouse asked. Thomas nodded. "Yeah." Rouse put his hand on Thomas's shoulder, and Thomas didn't push him away. About a week later, their orders came to return to the 47th. Thomas had sat down once or twice with the intention of writing to Colonel Jessup, but had never quite managed it. He hadn't realized until he had the departure orders in his hand that a small part of him hadn't been entirely sure they'd want him back. Not for any particular reason. He knew the wardmaster wasn't angry about the billeting sergeant anymore, but no one else had ever asked him back after sending him away. None of the others seemed at all surprised when Thomas told them about their orders. They were to leave in a little less than a week, which was more notice than you often got. "Wonder if they really fixed up the barn," Birkin said, looking around the barracks. "Or if they just decided it's warm enough now we could survive sleeping there." "I haven't heard anything," Thomas said, "but the wardmaster said they'd fix it." Still, even with a new roof, the barn was going to be a step down. It had taken him a month to get used to sleeping in a bed again, but now that he wasn't overly keen on going back to a bedroll on flagstones.
"Are you going to make us do extra drill and shout at us about our uniforms again?"
Blank wanted to know. Thomas thought that was one of his stupider questions. As Thomas had explained, he'd done that for a reason. But everyone else looked a bit eager to hear the answer too. "No," he said. "Even if they've suddenly started doing drilling uniform inspections there, we're ready for it. But let's try and make a good showing of it tomorrow, all right?" The whole platoon was scheduled to do stretcher drill the next afternoon. Colonel Utley usually turned up for that. "Should be the last one we have to do for a while." "Thank God!" said Manning. To be honest, Thomas didn't think much of stretcher drill either. All of the maneuvers assumed you had as much room as you needed and that you were in no particular hurry. Stretcher drill by squads at least had the benefit that each man on the squad could take a turn leading it, which was helpful when it came to picking team leaders for work details. But stretcher drill by platoon resembled nothing so much as an extremely dull circus act, like the one where the clowns carried around a ladder if they forgot to make any humorous mistakes. Still, they got through it, and Thomas's section did as well as anybody else, and better than some. Better yet, they had the rest of the afternoon off, and they walked back to the barracks from the parade ground, discussing what they were going to do with it. "Think I'll go for a drink," Rouse said. "You?" Thomas didn't have anything better to do. "Yeah, all right. Rawlins, you coming?" Rawlins considered for a moment, then shook his head. "The nurses are having a tennis tournament. Want to come? We can go for a drink any time, but we don't have that back at the 47th. Since the weather had turned warm, watching the nurses play tennis had become the most popular leisure activity for orderlies and ambulatory patients alike. Thomas had a theoretical understanding of the appeal, but had difficulty feigning enthusiasm for it. Rouse, he now knew, wouldn't be any more interested than he was, but for the look of the thing, Thomas said to him, "I could use a drink, but we can do that instead if you want." "Nah," said Rouse. "You can tell us who won," he told Rawlins. Rawlins shrugged. "Suit yourselves." As they walked toward the village, Rouse said, "You ready to go back?" Thomas nodded. "You?" "More than ready." "Do you think they'll, Thomas gestured at the absence of stripes on Rouse's sleeve. "Put you back up?" Rouse scoffed. "No, I do all right at the 83rd, but I don't have it as good as you do at the 47th. "Yeah?" He wasn't sure what Rouse meant. The 83rd was closer to the front, certainly, but Rouse didn't seem bothered by that.
I'm not saying you don't deserve it, Rouse went on. God knows you work hard, but I hope you know the stars really lined up for you on that one.
Thomas gave him a sidelong look. It definitely wasn't proximity to the front that he was talking about.
Don't get me wrong. I've had my share of lucky breaks, just not in the war. I'd still be down the pit if somebody hadn't taken an interest at the right moment. I could see right away when you lot turned up at the aid post that Jessup and Allenby had taken an interest in you.
Oh, that. Captain Allenby, of course he knew that, but...
Yes, sir? Oh, you're sure? Of course, what do you...
He stopped, turned to face Thomas, and gave him a slow, lingering up and down look. Thomas returned it, not with intent. Theo was right that Rouse wasn't his type, but that wasn't what Rouse was asking.
Right, said Rouse. Thought so, but I meant an interest in your career.
Oh, Thomas said, feeling rather stupid.
So did you and Allenby? Made a pass, but I turned him down, Thomas said. He's all right, though. Knows how to take no for an answer. I noticed that, too. He hunched his shoulders. Not really interested in being anybody's bit of rough, thanks.
No, he didn't suppose Rouse would be.
I don't mind that sort of thing, but I just didn't fancy it. That wasn't the truth, of course, not the whole truth. Too soon after Peter.
Rouse looked confused for a moment, then comprehension dawned.
He wasn't your brother.
It wasn't really a question, but Thomas answered it anyway.
No.
Carefully, not looking at Rouse, he said,
We met working for Lady Waterstone, my first job. We were best mates from the beginning. The other part was new. He inhaled sharply through his nose. We were going to... After the war, we were going to try to figure out some way. His breath shuddered on the way out. Some way to have a life together. Oh, Christ, said Rouse, and it sounded more like a prayer than blasphemy. I'm so sorry.
Thomas nodded and tried to breathe evenly. He'd never said it before, never laid it out like that, what it was that he'd lost. He shook his head.
Sorry. What were you saying about Corporal Jessup and Captain Allenby?
Rouse gave him a sidelong look, but nodded.
Right. I could see that they were,
He paused for a moment, marshalling his thoughts, but thankfully didn't turn the subject back to Peter.
They were setting you up to show what you could do. There's two ways to do that. I've had both. If they want to see you fail, they throw you into something you're not ready for, and then tell you how you should have done it. The other way, the good way, they give you what you need to get it right, and then watch to see if you're clever enough to use it. Like, doing the tetanus antitoxin injections. I don't think Jessup ever said that he was teaching you how to do it, but he made sure you had plenty of chances to watch him do it before he had you try one.
Carefully keeping his thoughts on the time at the aid post, not anything before that, and certainly not any imagined future, Thomas began to get a sense of what he meant. Jessup had often told him things or showed him things without making a point of why Thomas might need to know them. And then, a day or two later, he'd say,
Well, lad, do you remember how to...
Carson had done something like that in his early days at the Abbey. He'd asked him to describe how to do this or that,
or even worse, to demonstrate it,
and then explain in detail, usually in front of an audience, what Thomas had got wrong. But when Jessup did that, Thomas usually did remember. He thought perhaps that it was just that he was older and more responsible, better at paying attention. That probably was part of it. But what if another part, a bigger part, was that Carson hadn't wanted Thomas to pass his little tests? Then he thought of the workroom behind the clock shop. How many times had he struggled with something? Even something as simple as opening the back of a clock to clean it, only to have Dad, Mr. Barrow, wordlessly hand him a different tool than the one he'd been using. It was, he thought, not quite as good as Jessup's way, but miles better than Carson's.
I see what you mean,
he said, pulling himself back to the present. They were entering the village now. He had to be careful.
The War Master does that too. Like how he told me before we left that we had to be ready for drill and inspections.
Rouse nodded. Yeah, nobody warned me about that. Even if they had, I wouldn't have done as good a job as you did. But they didn't. Maybe they didn't know, or didn't think it was important. Or maybe they set me up to get taken down a peg. He shrugged. Jessup, you're Wardmaster. They want to see you win, and they're in a position to see you get something like a fair shot at it. That's not something blokes like us always have.
Don't I know it?
Said Thomas. Story of his life, that was. I'm sure you do, Rouse agreed. But what you have to remember is the blokes we're up against. They've always had that. Take Rollins, for instance.
Rollins is all right,
Thomas objected. He is, Rouse nodded. He knows you're better than he is, and he doesn't resent it. That's rare. But how old were you when you left school?
14.
Obviously.
You were supposed to have your learner's certificate to be a corporal. Thomas had read it in one of the manuals.
Just out of curiosity, did anyone ever suggest you might keep going?
Thomas scoffed. No, wasn't Nick clever enough for that?
Yes, you are, said Rouse. You're cleverer than at least half the blokes I went to secondary school with.
The ones who were paying their own way, you mean? Thomas said. He had only a vague idea of how scholarships for secondary school worked, but he knew you had to be more than just averagely clever to get one.
Those whose mums and dads were paying their way, Rouse corrected. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you could have gotten a scholarship if somebody'd taken an interest in you back then. I sure couldn't have done it on my own. This one all right? He asked, indicating an estaminet.
Sure.
They went inside and found a table. Sunday afternoon, the place was about half full. Rouse ordered a pint, Thomas a vin blanc. The barmaid was a woman at least a decade older than either of them, maybe two, rouged and uncorseted. Once she'd brought their drinks, Rouse went on. But my point is, the whole system's rigged against blokes like us. To go to secondary school, first I had to be the cleverest lad in my council school. Then the schoolmaster had to notice that I was, and he had to decide he was willing to put in a lot of time he wasn't getting paid for to do something about it. All that just for it to even be a question whether I might be able to go. And then me dad had to figure out a way we could get by if I was spending all my time studying when other lads my age were starting to earn a wage. But somebody like Rollins, he'd have to be a few bricks shy of a load before there was even a question that he wouldn't keep on with school. Thomas nodded slowly, remembering how Rollins had talked about being groomed for management at the factory where his father worked, because he didn't have any better idea of what he'd like to do. He hadn't really thought about it at the time. Thomas was used to looking at people like the Crawleys or Philip Crowborough, and compared to them, any advantages Rollins had would barely register. But really, what would it be like to have a life where management was where you ended up because you weren't trying?
I see what you mean, he said, taking a sip of his wine.
It was thin and vinegary.
But there's nothing we can do about it.
No, Rouse agreed. But that's what I mean about you being lucky at the 47th. You ever have somebody in your corner before?
No, said Thomas. Then, Peter, that Lady Waterstone's.
Rouse nodded. What did you do there, anyway? For a job?
We were junior footmen, Thomas said. Rouse probably didn't know what that meant, or would he? Polished the silver, washed the crystal, answered the door, carried in guests' luggage, helped wait at table. He glanced at Rouse. You know, it doesn't sound like much.
Rouse laughed. Was trying not to say that.
The hard part is that you're on display, but you aren't really supposed to be seen. Like wallpaper. You only really notice it if there's something wrong with it, so the point is to be so perfect that nobody notices you.
Rouse blew out of breath. Not sure I can handle that.
Well, you have to be tall, too, so...
Rouse lit a cigarette and offered the pack to Rouse, who took one.
They want matched pairs, like carriage horses. There's a household manual that actually says that.
Blimey, not sure I wouldn't rather be a pit pony than a carriage horse. If those are the only two choices. Thomas would most definitely not.
I suppose it's all in what you're used to. I reckon that's why I'm all right at drill. It's the same kind of invisibility. If it's going right, the individual people just disappear in plain sight.
Yeah, that bit of it kind of makes my skin crawl, said Rouse. I've never wanted to disappear.
After the Albion, that was all Thomas had wanted. Was it still? He wasn't sure.
So that was
He signaled the barmaid for another drink. Thomas caught her eye and nodded too. I wondered when I was on FP. You told them all not to look at me? Yeah, Thomas said, speaking of things that made one's skin crawl. Rouse nodded. I figured that had to be a kindness in your head. Wasn't sure how. What, did you want us to look at you? Not garlic, said Rouse. I was looking for some kind of a sign, though. Yes, we see what's happening, and it sure is messed up. It wasn't until I thought about it a bit that I realized you were coming at it from the other direction, like. Yeah, Thomas said, still not really understanding what Rouse had wanted him to do. Sorry. Don't worry about it, thanks, he added to the barmaid as she brought their second round. Once she'd left, he continued, It was watching Kingston that really got to me. I know you didn't have a choice about that. Well, said Thomas, I could have said I'd have no part of it and ended up standing next to you. Just thinking about it made him nauseous. Yeah, said Rouse. That's probably what I'd have done had the situation been reversed. Thomas nodded. He thought so. Rouse went on. But I'm not saying it would have been wise of me. It's not like we're the only two blokes qualified to run fatigues, and I don't imagine two orderlies making a stink would impress them any more than one. At the 47th, maybe, where you're the wardmaster's fair-haired boy, but not here. At the 47th, somebody might have listened to you, too. Captain Allenby, for one. You have a point there. Thomas hesitated. I don't suppose there's any way we could get you transferred? If there was, did he really want to suggest it? The wardmaster liked him because he was working class and bright. He'd be inviting in a rival who could best him on both counts. But Rouse said, I doubt it. I'm not sure how all that works, but I think if it could be done, it'd take somebody working it at both ends, and I wouldn't know where to start at the 83rd. Don't worry about it. If I were stuck here, I might be grasping at straws for a way out, but I'm alright at the 83rd. I get to do a decent amount of real medical work when I'm at the regimental aid post, and when I'm not there, they usually put me on night duty. I can generally stay out of trouble as long as nobody's standing over my shoulder picking at my every move. It was on night duty that Rouse had gotten into trouble here, but Thomas didn't argue the point. All right. I mean, if you hear something where it makes sense to put in a word for me, I'd appreciate it. But don't go sticking your neck out. He hesitated. You know, even if they like you, you only get to pull those strings so many times, right? Oh, no. He hadn't, in fact, been thinking of that. But that was how it was if they liked you, because they were sleeping with you. There was no reason this would be any different. Figured. Deciding that it was about time to talk about something other than himself, Thomas said, Speaking of Captain Allenby, he mentioned before we left that he was interested in the shell shock treatments they were working on here. What do you suppose I ought to tell him about it? As he'd expected, Rouse had definite ideas on the subject, and they talked about that through another round of drinks and a plate of egg and chips each, until it was time to head back to the station. When they were nearly there, though, and Thomas thought about the fact that he'd probably not speak to Rouse alone again, he said, Peter, liked you a lot. He said, What had he said? Thomas had tried not to think about his letters, not to think about him at all, for so long. That he admired you greatly, or immensely, something like that. Rouse gave him a sidelong look. Thanks, that's good to know. He was something special. We all loved him. He was just good, Thomas said. He was just good. And he made other people want to be good too. Yeah, said Rouse. That's it. That's exactly it. A few days later, they went back to the 47th. Rouse's section left first thing in the morning on the march, but they were told that morning that an ambulance was expected from the 47th, so they might as well wait and catch a ride back. It was a bit of a squeeze, and some of them ended up hanging on to the outside, but they were back to the 47th not much after lunchtime. Approaching, Thomas could see that there had been some changes. The road went through the transport corps area first, and there were a lot more vehicles and horses, as well as several new huts. What's that? Somebody up front asked as they passed a particularly large one. Munitions store, the driver said. Their old station had grown, too. There was a new block of wards going up, and the surgical hut was twice as big as it had been. The ambulance yard looked just the same, though, and so did the orderly's room when they trooped inside. While a couple of the others set about seeing if a cup of tea could be had, Thomas cautiously poked his head into the NCO's room.
Jessup was there doing something at his desk.
Hey,
Thomas said.
Jessup turned.
Lad! He got up. You're looking fit. How was it?
All right, I guess. We spent a lot of time on fatigues. Are we supposed to report in anyway?
Jessup shook his head. Wardmaster will want to see you, but you're not on roster until tomorrow.
Oh, good. Give us a chance to get settled back in. I'll be back in a minute.
Aye, his office is in the same place it was, he added, tilting his head in that direction. Thomas hadn't quite realized that he meant the wardmaster wanted to see him right then, but he went. Before he was halfway down the passage, he could hear the wardmaster shouting and swearing as usual. His door was open, and there was somebody in there with him. He hesitated, but Joseph had said that the wardmaster wanted to see him. He knocked. What? The wardmaster bellowed. The two sergeants standing in front of his desk shuffled to one side.
It's Barrow, Sergeant,
he said as the two sergeants standing in front of the desk shuffled to one side.
Reporting in.
Oh, he said, beckoning. You're back. You bring back all your men. That had to be a joke. Why wouldn't he have?
Yes, Sergeant.
How was it, son?
Different,
Thomas said.
I think we did all right. Upheld the honor of the 47th.
Good. He glanced at the two sergeants. I want to hear all the fuck about it, but I'm in the middle of something here. Come back before dinner, alright?
Yes, Sergeant.
The War-Master nodded. You been out to the fucking barn yet?
No.
We'll fuck off and have a look at it, he said, and turned his attention back to the two sergeants. That was strange. With a mental shrug, Thomas went back to the orderly's room, stopping on the way to check the posted duty roster.
We're all on day shift tomorrow, he told the others. D wards. All we have to do today is get settled in back at the barn.
Oh, sweet barn, somebody said as they all started picking up their bags. Night off, Manning said. Are we going out? Everybody looked at him. He shrugged.
I have to meet the wardmaster before dinner, but maybe I'll catch up later.
They might be expecting him in the NCO's mess. Who knew? They could see the improvement in the barn even before they reached it, as soon as they turned up Petticoat Lane. The roof was now covered in shingles, a patchwork of different colors and sizes. Thomas thought of a time back at Downton, when some of the slate tiles on the east wing roof had come off during a heavy storm. The replacements had been a shade or two lighter in color, and Carson had tutted over the unsightliness of it all, but there was nothing to be done. The quarry the old ones had come from, the workmen said, had closed. Arriving at the barn, Thomas walked around it, while the others went inside. The half-rotted shutters over the windows had been replaced too, and the latrine had been moved and the old pit filled in. Something Thomas had realized reading his RAMC training manual that was likely overdue to be done. There was also at least a cord of firewood stacked neatly against the wall on the side opposite from the direction the wind usually came. Somebody really had made an effort. The thought was oddly warming. From inside, he heard Rollins say, "Fuck me blind!" It must have picked the expression up from Rouse, and Thomas smiled a little at how it sounded in his accent. Rollins stuck his head out the door. "Barrow, you've got to see this!"
Coming.
Inside, there were a dozen bunks, set up in rows with footlockers and a stack of bedding on each one. He looked up, and the roof was bright new wood under the shingles.
"Christ!"
he said. "Bit of all right, isn't it?" said Collins.
"It's a fucking palace!"
He put his kit down on the bunk between Rollins and Perkins. "Is somebody gonna make the tea?" Someone did, and they'd picked up bread, cheese, and jam rations before they left the station, so they had a slap-up tea as they stowed their gear and made up their bunks. At one point, a particularly bold mouse scampered out of the wall, heading for the breadcrumbs that were scattered around the stove, where some people had been toasting theirs.
"Well, that's one thing that hasn't changed,"
Thomas said.
"I have a plan about that,"
Collins said.
"We get a cat."
"Huh!" said Rollins thoughtfully.
"Where are we going to get a cat?"
Thomas asked. He saw them around, slinking in and out of piles of rubble, but they fled at the sight of a human being.
"We'd need a tame one."
But Collins said,
"Nurse Rutherford's had kittens a few weeks ago. She's giving them away in a couple of weeks. I said we might take one. All we have to do is get somebody to bring it back on the ambulance."
All right, so Collins had that part of the plan figured out.
"What do we feed it once we have it?" They eat mice, don't they? Rollins asked. If it's doing its job, after a bit there won't be enough mice around to keep it fed, Thomas said. We can bring back meat scraps from the mess, Collins said, and trade for fish heads and offal and things. We can get those for jam, no problem. Maybe milk, too. Tins of army jam were a common form of currency with the local people. The jam ration was a frankly ridiculous half-pound per day. Most of the time, the cooks traded it for something more sensible before you even saw it, but if you got your rations issued to you instead of eating in the mess, as they had today because they were theoretically on an all-day march, you got a tin each. They had 10 left from today's issue. Will that do it? Thomas asked. A cat needs to be fed every day, you know. Dad, Mr. Barrow, had said that when Jamie and Alice wanted a dog. Sardines, suggested Rollins, and condensed milk. I'm sure my family will send us some if I ask. Anybody else? We're going to have a milk and sardines rota in addition to the tea rota. Thomas asked. Several of them took it in turns to have their people back in England send the Fortnum Superior that they mixed in with the standard issue tea. Anna and Miss Hughes supplied Thomas's share. He wasn't sure they'd be amused if he started asking for cat food, too. My gran will, said Blank. She likes cats. Manning nodded too, and a couple of the others. Collins said, Mine would think I gone barking mad if I asked them to send food for a cat, but I could put in a sixpence now and then. A couple of other people nodded at that too. Seems like an awful lot of bother, Thomas pointed out. How much are the mice going to bother us now we're not sleeping on the ground and we've got lockers to put our stuff in it? Didn't think of that, Collins admitted. I guess we don't really need a cat. There was a long moment of silence until Rollins said, It'd be kind of nice, though. Make the place more home-like. Thomas would have pointed out that they were in a war. It wasn't supposed to be home-like. But several other people were murmuring in agreement. Could we get a dog instead? Asked Plank. A dog's a lot more trouble, Collins told him. And it's kittens Nurse Bradford has, not puppies. A cat's a lot more sensible, Rollins agreed. We should stick with that, if we get anything. He looked at Thomas expectantly, and soon everyone else was too. Belatedly, Thomas realized that they were waiting for him to say if they could have a cat or not, though really it seemed unlikely that the army would view decisions about barracks pets as part of a corporal's remit. I don't really see the point, though I suppose if we're all agreed, there's no harm in either. And that apparently meant that they were getting a cat. Everyone started talking about things like what to name it and things they'd heard about how to pick out a good mouser. They were still talking about it, in fact, when they headed back to the station, Thomas for his meeting with the wardmaster and the rest for various estimates. Rollins and a few others were bound for Granny's. If it's still open, Rollins said, and Thomas said he'd meet them there if he was free. This time the wardmaster was alone in his office, and he waved Thomas to the now familiar chairs in front of the fireplace, and brought over the also familiar bottle of Armagnac. Honestly, Thomas was beginning to wonder where we got the stuff. The way he went through it, he must have a regular source of supply. So, the wardmaster said, handing him a glass. How's the bomb? Everyone was very impressed, Thomas said. They had us in a proper barracks back at the clearing station, and we were all saying that was the only thing we'd miss. But I think this is even better. I heard about the barracks. Didn't want mutiny on my hands. That's about all I heard, though. About your lot, anyway. You didn't fancy it back there. Thomas hesitated. It wasn't what we're used to, I suppose. You were right about being ready for drill and inspections. We had an inspection 2 hours after we got there, and drill every morning for a week. And then they had us on fatigues, something like 2 weeks out of 3. He went on to explain about the shell shock patients. So some of it was work that really needed doing to get the new buildings ready, but some of it was just make work. Doc will be a real fucker when it comes to morale, the Warmaster said. Yeah, we were usually broken up in 2 or 3 work parties, so I rotated the teams around, had different team leaders each day to try and keep it interesting. Might have been more efficient to keep it the same every time, but once they started putting the shell shock cases with us, I could tell the efficiency wasn't what they were looking for. Cut down on complaints. If somebody thought they had a better idea, they'd have a chance to try it. Good, said the Wardmaster. You'd have come in for your share of fatigues if you'd been here, he added, stretching his boots out in front of him. You have a look around. Thomas nodded. I saw the new wards and the surgical building," he said cautiously. The others had noticed too, but there hadn't been much speculation about why they needed them.
"Yeah, you see the fucking munitions dump?"
Thomas nodded.
"We've got a new medical officer too. Had a surgery, and we're getting a new sections with orderlies. Maybe two."
He gave Thomas a steady look.
"You know what that means?"
Thomas was fairly sure he did.
"They're expecting us to be busier. The spring offensive?"
The Warmaster nodded. "Probably a summer offensive since Fritz started here so fucking early. They haven't said where yet, but they're building up at this end of the line. 3rd and 4th Army areas."
He looked weary. They were in the 4th Army area.
"Makes sense," Thomas said. "They've already tried breaking through in Flanders, twice."
That was the northern end of the front line, held by the Belgians and by the British 1st and 2nd Armies.
"Yeah, and it'll take some of the pressure off the French down at Verdun."
Verdun was where the Germans had begun their spring offensive in the southern part of the front, held by the French. The French line extended from Switzerland up to the river Somme, a dozen or so miles from where they sat.
"You figure we're in for it, then?"
"Yeah, I figure we're fucking in for it."
He took a deep breath.
"But not for a while yet, and it could be the 3rd takes the brunt of it. The next thing for us is going to be getting the new blokes up to speed."
"When do they come?"
"A little under a month."
He knocked back half his drink.
"So, new sections, new corporals. Who do you like?" "You've seen how your lads did leading work details. If you were picking corporals for the new sections, who would you tap?"
Oh, this was a test, obviously. But as Rouse had explained, it was one the Wardmaster wanted to see him pass. It would be more important to explain his reasoning than to guess who the Wardmaster was thinking of.
"Collins. I like the way he sizes up a job before he starts in on it. Doesn't just jump in with both feet."
His approach was a little more cautious than Thomas's was. Thomas tended to assume that if they fucked up, they'd go back and fix it.
"He's a farm lad. Turns out that involves more thinking than I realised. If you get something wrong, it might be a year before you can try again," he told me.
The Warmaster nodded encouragingly.
"And he was good with the shell-shock blokes, figuring out what they could handle and what they couldn't. The trick, the way the Major wanted it, is to make just enough allowances that they can contribute but not give them too much slack, and keep up with what they can do as they get better. I reckon you need to do that with new men too."
"Got it,"
he said.
"All right, anybody else?"
Thomas had to think a little more about the second name.
"Manning wants it, and people usually follow his lead. If I put him on a team with a leader who wasn't very good at it, he'd end up running it instead. And when I said about somebody thinking they had a better idea, that was usually him."
The Wardmaster shifted in his seat.
"How do you take it when his idea wasn't better?"
"He learned from it," Thomas said cautiously. "But you have to not rub it in. He's also, he was a better team leader when it was supposed to be somebody else's turn, because then he'd have to work to get the others on side with him. If he was supposed to be in charge, he'd just lean on that. Most of the others had the opposite problem. They'd stand there and let Manning argue with them until I came up and reminded them they were in charge, and then when he was in charge, I'd have to do the opposite and remind him not to get too high-handed with the others."
Said the Warmaster.
"Yeah,
Manning had resented it, and it was hard to blame him.
I missed something there. I tried to tell him that I was giving him the opposite advice because he was erring in the opposite direction, but I don't think I got through."
"It might just need to hear it from somebody other than you," the Warmaster said. "Manning's one I had my eye on. The others looked up to him, and he didn't lose his fucking shit when he came in and snatched his crown. That counts for a lot. He's a little too cocky, but he could shape up if somebody took him in hand."
Thomas was acutely aware that the Wardmaster could have been describing him, or at least him before the Albion.
"I'm not sure I'd have handled that so well in his shoes,"
he said. He knew for a fact he hadn't, when it had been Bates stealing his crown, or William, who'd come in from nowhere and become Carson's protege overnight, or Jamie, for that matter, stealing the crown he never stood to inherit.
"I do wonder if he ever regrets spreading around that hand story, though."
"Yeah, I reckon he was picturing you as his lieutenant, squire, right-hand man. But that's not you. Not by a fucking long shot."
Thomas took a gulp of his drink to cover his surprise. Most of his life, he'd have murdered to be somebody's right-hand man. Carson's protege, the Duke of Crowborough's favorite, the son of Barrow and Son's fine clocks. Was that why it had never worked out? Not because he wasn't good enough to be second fiddle, but because he was meant to be first?
What about Rollins?
the Wardmaster asked.
As a corporal? Yeah, as a fucking corporal.
Thomas hesitated.
Between you, me, and the doorpost? No. He's bright, but he's got no initiative, and he wants everybody to like him. He'd muddle along, but I don't think he'd be very good at it, or even want it if he really thought about it.
The Wardmaster nodded and tipped more army gack into Thomas's glass.
That was a fucking test, by the way. I know you, mates. That's my read on him, too. He's a clever sod, but lazy. If I gave him a section, you'd be running both of them.
He wasn't wrong. Rollins plus his right-hand man.
That would almost work, though, Thomas mused. He picks up things I miss. We're new blokes, he'd see it a long time before I did, if they were having a hard time. Not with the work, I mean. That I notice. With adjusting to all of this.
He gestured to indicate the station, the war, all of it. He wasn't the sort of person you'd go to if you were having nightmares, or if the sound of guns was getting so far into your head you couldn't think straight. No more than a new footman or hallboy would tell Carson that he was homesick, or that the first footman was picking on him. But they had Miss Hughes for that.
And I'm the last person they'd tell, especially once they heard the fucking hound story. But they'd go to him, and he'd tell me what I needed to know.
We're not fucking doing that, the Wardmaster said. If we had 3 new sections to sort out, maybe, but it'll be 2 at most.
Thomas nodded quickly. Right. It hadn't been a serious suggestion.
I was just thinking out loud.
He was saying more than he meant to, was what he was doing. It was hard to keep track of how much he was drinking since his glass never got empty before the Wardmaster filled it up again.
2 sections is too much for you, but you're right about Rollins. One of the things I'm thinking about doing is splitting up your section and mixing it with the new lads. If I decide to go that way, I'll keep it with you. Anybody else you want?
Thomas thought about it, marshalling his thoughts carefully before he spoke.
If I get Rollins, I should take Blank too. He's not what you'd call a quick thinker, but he works hard, so they balance each other out a bit. Winder, Perkins, Applegate, and Liston are all pretty solid, so I take 1 or 2 of them depending on who the other corporals are.
If it was somebody more experienced than he was, he'd keep 2.
If the other corporal really is going to be from our section, and it isn't Manning, he's going to kick. Probably best if he stays with me in that case.
He'd kick against Thomas too, but at least Thomas had some practice.
But if it's somebody Manning would look up to, then he should take him.
That's what I was thinking,
the Wardmaster agreed.
What about Collins, if we don't put him up?
He's not expecting it the way Manning is, Thomas said. As far as I know, anyway.
Maybe he should ask Rollins about that.
I'd be glad to have him, but if I already have Rollins and we wanted to do the other bloke a favour, I could live without him.
The Wardmaster nodded. What do you think of Applegate?
Thomas shrugged.
He's all right. Not the sharpest, but he tries. People like him.
With a heavy sigh, the Wardmaster topped up their glasses.
The brass like him.
Thomas squinted at him. The army gang might be starting to catch up with him. How would the officers know enough about Applegate to like him or not?
He went to a minor fucking public school.
Thomas set his glass down with a thud.
They like him for corporal!
The Wardmaster nodded.
Now I can tell them I had a talk with his corporal about leadership ability, and his name didn't fucking come up.
He shook his head.
This is all between you, me, and the doorpost, by the way. I want a chance to look at your lads before they know they're being watched. And if they end up not liking my decision, you don't need them to know you have anything to do with it.
Thomas had not entirely realized that he was having anything to do with it.
Of course,
he admitted.
I thought this was a test.
The Wardmaster shrugged.
You're not actually picking them. I am. But I'll take a look at Collins. I didn't have a good idea of who the fuck to suggest instead of Applegate. If you're right about him, that's going to solve a real fucking problem for me.
Glad I could help,
Thomas said, his head swimming slightly at the heady notion that the Wardmaster might really act on a suggestion from him, unless that was from the liquor.
If we're lucky, they'll drop Applegate when I give them another name. If not, we might need him to do a bit of a dirty.
Thomas heard the wet snap of Kingston's leg and saw Rouse tied to a fucking post. But that wasn't what the Wardmaster meant.
How do you mean?
Just put him out of his fucking depth for a bit. Make sure they see him floundering. I don't like setting a lad up like that, but it's better than the fucking alternative if it comes to it.
Thomas didn't know what to say and sipped out his drink instead. He didn't like the idea much either. The Wardmaster knocked back his drink, shook his head, and refilled it, sloshing a little more into Thomas's glass while he was at it.
So, they had you working with cell shock cases. How was that?
It weren't easy, Thomas said. They're meant to be light cases, but a lot of them seem to be in a pretty bad way, losing their voices, use of their limbs, and you weren't supposed to be too sympathetic to them. It really felt sometimes like they were just tormenting the poor sods. They'd have them out there working while they were still pretty ill.
Yeah, I'm not sure I like the sound of that, the wardmaster agreed. We didn't see shit like that in South Africa. You'd see heart trouble sometimes after a shock. Soldier's heart, they called it, but not many. They said it was more common in Crimea.
He shook his head.
I'm not surprised they don't know what to do with the poor fuckers. You gotta send them home, not when there's that many.
He gave Thomas a sidelong look.
Heard one of the other corporals had a real fucking problem with it.
Thomas nodded.
Rouse, he did.
He thought about whether to bring that up or not, but hadn't decided. On the one hand, it didn't reflect well on him, one way or another, but he wondered if the wardmaster would have any better ideas about what he could have done.
He didn't like any of it, but there was one case. I don't know how much you heard.
I heard some clever bugger of a corporal argue with a major about a case, got busted down and put on FP, and then it turned out he was right. I was pretty fucking relieved to hear it wasn't you.
I was involved a little bit, Thomas admitted. The bloke, his name was Kingston, started out with hysterical paralysis, but when that went away, he kept on insisting his leg hurt. Could barely move it or put weight on it. It was a little strange. Sometimes the hysterical symptoms clear up gradually, but they don't usually develop a new one in the middle of it.
Rouse had pointed that out to him when they talked about it afterward.
So Rouse examined him. He was a medical student before the war.
Oh,
said the wardmaster, nodding.
He's that clever bugger. Joseph told me about him. Mine his son made good.
Thomas nodded.
Bright as hell, but he can't quite get his head around the fact that he can't talk to officers like he's an equal. After he examined him, he came up with a theory that Kingston's leg really was broken, just not all the way through.
He went on to explain about the 2 times he covered Rouse's ward while he investigated his theory.
Sailing a little close to the fucking wind there, son,
the wardmaster pointed out. Thomas nodded contritely.
Sorry, Sergeant.
No, I'm fucking impressed. It just doesn't seem like you.
Thomas had momentarily forgotten that he had a reputation here as a rule follower.
Well, if anyone had asked, I thought I was covering for him for a bit while he met a girl. I was shocked as anyone about the gross insubordination he was really up to.
The wardmaster nodded.
Good. So I take it he got caught the second fucking time.
Yeah, that one was a lot riskier, and I still don't know what he thought he was going to do with the new x-rays, even if they did prove he was right. The way it turned out, the MO refused to even look at them until after the poor bastard broke his leg the rest of the way.
He went on to explain about Rouse's FP and Kingston's part in it.
Fucking sadists! Even if they really believed they had to do that to Kingston to cure him, they didn't have to make Rouse watch. And make the rest of us watch Rouse watching. They had his section out there too.
They do that,
the wardmaster said.
Make a fucking spectacle. Keeps anyone else from getting ideas.
Well, it worked. The next day they had us digging graves. Kingston, too. I just about sat up and begged to convince that major I wasn't going easy on him.
He downed the rest of his drink before telling the wardmaster about the major's bit of theatre with a shovel and his small but shameful part in it.
It wasn't right. I don't see how I could have stopped it, but I could have at least said it wasn't right.
The wardmaster sighed and refilled Thomas's glass.
Would have been pissing into the wind if you had, he said, and it sounds like they had fucking enough of corporals getting mouthy about this particular issue. The smart thing to do would have been to get another officer to take an interest in the case before this major had dug his heels in too far. A major might bend his fucking neck enough to listen to a captain who disagrees with him about a case, but not a fucking corporal.
Thomas nodded.
That's what I thought. But getting officers on his side is not one of Rouse's strong suits. And I was trying to keep me head down.
Yeah, that's one of those things that's a good idea right up until it isn't. He sighed. That's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, but don't beat yourself up over it. By the time it got that bad, I'm not sure there's anything I could have done to stop it.
Thomas nodded, and his head spun a little.
Apart from giving Rouse a clip round the ear,
the wardmaster added.
Which sounds to me like he could fucking use.
He'd more than had one, Thomas thought. But maybe it would mean a bit more coming from another working-class bloke.
Yeah.
They'll be looking for us in the mess soon,
the wardmaster went on.
Anything else you want to talk about?
There was something about the new sections. What was it? The others will be wondering,
You could tell that we're getting a new section or two, and that there's no official word yet about an offensive, but I see the same things they do, and I've drawn the same fucking conclusions. When they see the next duty roster, they might guess I'm looking for corporals, but don't confirm it.
Thomas nodded, and then remembered why it wasn't a good idea to do that just now. That was good to know. They would ask what the wardmaster had said, but it wasn't what he'd been thinking of. "They're talking about getting a cut," he said. That was part of it.
The wardmaster gave him a funny look. Yeah?
Reviewing that statement, Thomas realized it hadn't made a lot of sense.
I mean, they're going to want to know about the billet, if we're moving out or getting split up, before we get too settled in.
Oh. No, we're gonna put the new lads up at tents through the summer. Get the fucking cat.
He refilled his glass one more time, and before Thomas could stop him, sloshed some more into his too, saying,
"One more before we go."
Thomas was beginning to think he'd had more than enough, but it wasn't as though the wardmaster could put it back in the bottle. He knocked it back and then staggered as he got up.
"Easy there, son."
The wardmaster steadied him with a hand on his back.
"Cat, what?"
he asked as they headed for the mess.
"For the mice,"
Thomas explained.
"since everything is fixed now, and one of the nurses had kittens."
He blinked.
"Her cat had kittens, I mean."
"Yeah, I reckon it would have made the fucking papers otherwise,"
the wardmaster said. Thomas, there was no other word for it, giggled.
"Right, so that last one was a fucking mistake,"
the wardmaster said. "Out of practice," Thomas said as they went outside. It had been a long time since the fucking Criterion.
"Criterion, huh? Posh sucker."
And he said that aloud.
"More ways than one."
He giggled again. The wardmaster grabbed him by the scruff of the neck.
"Hey."
"Oh, fuck,"
Thomas had a tendril of fear worming its way through the soft alcoholic haze that had crept up and covered everything.
"I said that out loud too, didn't I?"
"You're dead,"
the wardmaster confirmed.
"Do I need to put you back in my office to sober up before you say anything else out loud?"
He meant because it was a military offense to be drunk in public, not because the wardmaster understood the significance of what Thomas had said. The way he could tell was that he was standing there with his hand on Thomas's neck and not shoving him away in disgust. He took a deep breath of the cold night air and pulled himself together.
"I'm all right."
"All right."
He nodded, releasing Thomas.
"Keep your mouth shut, or do you get something in your stomach to soak up all that booze?"
"Yes,"
Thomas said.
"I will do that, Sergeant."
In the mess, he put Thomas into a seat next to Jessup and said,
"Keep an eye on him. He's a little tight. I'm not being very careful."
Jessup gave him a sympathetic look.
"Did you try to keep up with him?" "Not quite,"
Thomas said.
"Just, one too many."
"That happens with him," Jessup said, casting a worried eye toward the wardmaster, taking his seat at the head of the table. Barrow did sober up as he got his dinner into him. Fortunately. That could be tricky, drinking on an empty stomach and then trying to rectify the lack afterwards. By the time dinner was over, Jessup was comfortable leaving him to make his own way back to his billet. Also, fortunately, the lad was clever enough to realize that catching up to his mates in whatever estaminet they called into wasn't a particularly good idea. Tooley, on the other hand. "We're getting the lad drunk now," he asked as they settled down in Tooley's office.
"Is that a good idea?"
"I wanted to loosen him up, so he'd tell me if anything was bothering him,"
Tooley answered, gulping down some more of his French liquor.
"And it worked. A little too well. He didn't drop any more fucking hairpins, did he?"
Jessup shook his head.
"What did he say? Or do?"
"About that? Nothing anybody else would have noticed. Just that he used to drink at the Criterion, and he's a posh fucker in more ways than one." He chuckled. "That's the fucking reason. I kinda wanted to bring him back here, give him a few more, and see what happened."
That wasn't a good idea either, and Tooley knew it. Jessup changed the subject.
"Was anything bothering him?"
"Yeah. You remember Rouse?"
Jessup nodded.
"Sharp lad."
"Sharp enough to fucking cut himself."
Tooley went on to tell an entirely unsurprising story about Rouse going toe-to-toe with an officer and paying the price.
Barrow kept out of it, but it rattled him some.
That was the sort of thing that rattled Barrow. He and Rouse are mates.
A fucking guy then.
Tooley poured himself another drink.
He seems to have done all right otherwise. No major problems with the section. He likes Collins, the corporal.
You asked him. Jessup didn't think he would have. Barrow had only been a corporal himself for a couple of months.
He had to take it turns leading work duties.
Tooley explained.
What do you think? It was on your list, wasn't he?
The list of names Jessup had given him when Tooley asked for someone else to consider alongside Manning and Applegate, he meant. It was, he agreed. He wondered if Tooley really didn't remember, if he was that drunk, or if he just wanted to hear Jessup agree with what he was already planning to do. Didn't stand out above the others, but then none of them did. That was why it was a list and not a name. He's thinking of trying him out next week.
Yeah, but he's picking one out of a fucking hat, and if it's no good, we'll learn something about Barrow.
He had a point. All right, so Collins, Manning, and Applegate then.
Unless I can talk Thwaite out of Applegate, then I still need a third name.
Barrow didn't have one.
No, I tried asking who he wanted to keep if I split up the section, but he went for balancing the two sections instead of skimming the cream off the top.
That's good though, Jessup pointed out.
Yeah, just not fucking helpful in the present situation. Gave me an idea though. What do you think of having him drop a roster for next week? Tell him who we picked for Lance Corporal, see how he divvies the rest of them.
That wasn't a bad idea. Was a better one, in fact, than asking him to weigh in on promotions. All right, and then he runs it by me.
Yeah, we might have to give him a hint about not propping up Applegate too much.
That was another thing Jessup wouldn't have brought the lad in on. You told him that too.
I fucking alluded to it.
Tooley admitted. They're his mates, Jessup reminded him.
Oh, we've got a fucking bush coming. We need to know if he can be a bastard.
Tooley took a swig from his drink.
I don't like it any more than you do.
He might like it even less if the amount of drinking he was doing was any indication. Or maybe it was just that Tooley was the one who'd have to decide where they put Barrow when the shit hit. Sometimes it was, as Tooley would say, a real fucking relief to just be a corporal. Yeah, Jessup said. All right, what else do you have in mind for him? As Jessup had hoped, that distracted Tooley from thinking about the push, and from reaching for the bottle again.
We'll keep him with the section for about a week, then switch him over to clerk. You're dead right that if we let him, he'll end up running all three sections. I mentioned how we couldn't put Rollins up for that very fucking reason, and he almost had me giving it a second thought.
No, Jessup said. A sergeant ran 4 sections. Jessup had done it a time or two, but he couldn't keep track of that many people, what they needed, what they were good for. He hasn't been in the army a year yet.
Oh no, he did convince me to keep Rollins with him though, to handle the soft stuff.
Handling the soft stuff was what Jessup had done for Tooley in the early days. And still did, he supposed. Good. We can't expect the new batch of new lads to take to this as easily as he did.
That's what he said, more or less,
Tooley said.
So we'll clerk for me until the new lads get it, and then we start training them. I wish the fucking hell we knew how much time we have.
Until the push, he meant. They might give us some idea by then, Jessup suggested.
Might.
Tooley agreed.
But it's not wait to get them up toward the front.
Jessup didn't point out that Tooley had been the one dragging his feet on that with the last batch. No, best not. Will we have Barrow and the other new corporals take them? Tooley nodded and reached for the bottle. Thomas didn't have to wait long to find out what the wardmaster had meant about the next duty roster, and the section figuring out that the wardmaster was looking for corporals. They were on night shift on the wards. In fact, they made up most of the night shift roster, with Collins, Manning, and Applegate named as lance corporals. Who's going on which blocks? He asked Jessup when he found him in the NCO's room after seeing the roster. You tell me, Jessup said, handing him a stack of personal files. These are your extra men. If there's anything else you want to know about them, I'm right here. Thomas hesitated. You've been doing this for months, lad, Jessup reminded him. It's no different. It was different because they were working on wards with actual patients, not digging holes in the ground. But Thomas didn't argue, just sat down and got to work. One more thing, Jessup added. Thomas looked up at him. What master says not to do Applegate too many fucking favors. You follow?
I do.
Thomas nodded.
Thanks.
He worked on it for the rest of the day, in between his duties on wards, moving men around, trying different configurations. It reminded him queerly of when he'd sat at his desk a few months ago and worked out drill maneuvers using paper clips. This was a bit more complicated. The way night duty worked was that each ward was covered by 1 or 2 men, depending on how many patients it had, and each block of 3 or 4 wards had a corporal or lance corporal in charge. Collins, Manning, and Applegate would each have a block, and Thomas himself would have the 4th. Several times he thought he was almost finished, only to discover that he'd left someone out, or put someone else in 2 places at once. It was just before dinner that he finally had it done and took it to Jessup.
Does this look alright?
He hoped Jessup would tell him if he was making any big mistakes. "Aye, lad," he said, reading it. "Next comes the hard part.
What's that?"
"When your lads take charge of their blocks, and you stay out of their way."
"How?"
Thomas said. He had, in fact, put himself in B block because it was in the middle of things, so he could keep an eye on everyone else. "Remember the first time you were Night Corporal on D?" Jessup asked. "You want them to know they can come to you if they have questions, but don't look over their shoulders the whole time." Thomas nodded.
"I remember."
It really was the hard part, as he learned a few nights later, when they started their night duty. Jessup had told him he could take a walk around the other blocks in the early part of the shift to see that everyone was settling in, but apart from that he was supposed to keep to his own ward unless asked. The walk around went well, but he kept wondering if he ought to make another one just in case. Out of sheer nerves, he checked the wards on his own block often enough that Rollins, Plank, and Widener started to looking exasperated when they saw him. His only hint of how things were going on the other blocks came when Captain Allenby wandered in, saying he'd just come from A block's men's sick, where Collins had summoned him to check on a patient's elevated fever.
"It wasn't that high," Allenby added. "I expect he's a bit nervous." "Sorry he woke you for nothing, sir," Thomas said.
"It's all right," Allenby said. "I was hoping I'd get a chance to see you." To talk about the shell-shock treatments, he might mean. Or not. He really wasn't bad-looking, with his boyish face and his serious eyes, and Thomas wasn't quite as numb to the prospect as he had been last year. In fact, he'd found himself responding a bit when Rollins crowded up to him the way he did. Even worse, lately his thoughts had been turning fondly to the memory of the wardmaster grabbing his neck outside the mess. He'd even dreamed about it once and woken up vaguely aroused and specifically horrified. So maybe it was time to start thinking about it, at least. It wasn't as though they could do anything now, not with his entire section on the wards and liable to come looking for him any second. But they could certainly talk. Thomas leaned back in his seat, set his shoulders at an angle to Allenby's, and said, "Here I am."
"I see that."
Allenby took out 2 cigarettes, lit them, and handed one to Thomas.
"How was the CCS?"
"Not terribly interesting," Thomas said. "Rouse was there."
"I'm sure that wasn't why it was uninteresting,"
Allenby noted.
"No,"
Thomas agreed. "We missed you, actually."
"Oh?"
Allenby raised an eyebrow. He might have made that sound a bit more exciting than it really was, Thomas realized. He dialed it back a bit and said, He really got into a bit of a jam. We thought you'd have helped if you'd been there." People liked that. Posh fuckers, as the wardmaster would say, liked the idea that they could help you, as long as you didn't ask for too much.
"How's that?"
So Thomas told him about Kingston, skimming lightly over the real horror of it, and leaning on the fact that they'd been under their depth without a kindly officer to turn to.
"Field punishment?"
Allenby said when he got to that part.
"Good Lord! That seems a bit of an overreaction." "I'm not sure what Rouse said to him, but it was probably fit to peel the paint off the walls,"
Thomas said.
"You know Rouse." "He does seem to respond better to sympathetic handling," Allenby said.
"It sounds ghastly. What happened to the patient?"
"They sent him back to Blighty. Said he'd probably need at least 1 more operation.
And if the fracture was still incomplete, he'd only need bed rest," Allenby said with a shake of his head.
"So I take it you didn't think much of the treatment program? Even for patients who don't have broken legs?"
"Most of them improved," Thomas said cautiously, aware that he was, after all, talking to an officer. "But it seemed cruel. And I wondered whether the improvement would last, once they were up at the front again. The only thing they got there that they wouldn't get at a rest camp was the major talking to them for 5 minutes at a time every couple of days. I don't see how much that could help." Allenby nodded. There are some psychiatrists getting good results with talk therapy, particularly for officers, but the dose needs to be a bit larger than that. He glanced at his watch and sighed. I should go back and check on the patient in A again, he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. I expect he's fine, but I, unlike some people, pay attention when my orderlies think something's wrong. Thomas smiled like he was supposed to.
That you do, sir.
I hope we can talk again.
I'm on nights all week,
Thomas said cautiously. Allenby knew that the duty roster was public.
Well, of course. I wish there was some place we could go and really catch up.
There was a hint of a question in his tone, and Thomas said cautiously,
I'd like that. I'm not sure how, though. We're not allowed in the same estimates.
He wasn't quite ready to accept an invitation back to Allenby's billet either.
No, Allenby agreed. If we were in London, I could think of a place or two to take you.
So could Thomas.
Downstairs bar at the Criterion?
Exactly.
Après Anguille,
Thomas suggested. After the war, it was how respectable French women responded to soldiers' blandishments, and how French taught open negotiation.
If we both live that long.
Après Anguille, Allenby agreed. The next morning at breakfast, most of the section reported quiet nights on their wards. Apart from a few dysentery cases who had required unscheduled bed baths and a change of sheets, Collins's fever patient was the most excitement anyone had had.
Was it the M.O. Cross that you woke him up for nothing?
Applegate asked.
He didn't seem like it,
Collins answered uncertainly.
It's better to wake him and find out you didn't need to than not wake him and find out you should have, Thomas told him. And Captain Allenby's all right, he won't mind.
Even if they were giving Applegate enough rope to hang himself, that wasn't a mistake Thomas wanted him making. How do you know? Manning asked.
They were at the aid post together,
Rollins reminded him. The next few days also went smoothly enough. The day corporals had complaints about all three of the lance corporals' paperwork, so Thomas spent a bit of time going over it with them. Collins's got better right away. Mannings's, once he made up his mind to make an effort, and Applegate tried. He had trouble remembering what went in which column of the ledger, even when Thomas made up an example page for him to look at. He also had a hard time keeping track of all the things he was supposed to do each night, and usually skipped one minor chore or another. The most serious was the time he forgot to record anything from the midnight round of pulses and temperatures. He swore up and down that he had done them, and Thomas believed him, but he had somehow managed to do the whole ward without remembering that he was supposed to write them on the patient's charts. When that happened, Joseph said that he thought they'd take him off Lance Corporal duty and try someone else, but after he met with the wardmaster, the duty roster stayed unchanged. Thomas didn't see the wardmaster himself for most of the week, and when he finally did, it was at the worst possible moment. It all started when Cadman came into his ward at about 2 a.m, whispering urgently about someone hemorrhaging in C Block's men's surgical.
What are you getting me for? Thomas asked. Get Allenby!
I did, he said.
But can you come? Collins wants you.
All right. After getting Rollins to keep an eye on his ward as well as his own, he grabbed his coat and went over to see. The lights were on in men's surgical, and Allenby was barking orders. Put pressure here, clamp this, tell surgical prep we're coming, for God's sake, hurry! Then suddenly he fell silent. It happened just about when Morris and another bloke showed up with a stretcher. Allenby started to wave them away, then shook his head and motioned them back. Morgue, he said simply. Quite a few of the patients were sitting up and watching the show. They started whispering behind their beds.
What happened? Why'd he stop?
Copped it.
Poor blighter pegged out.
Meanwhile, Morris and the other bloke gathered up the body, and Collins stood there like a statue. He was white as one, too, under his freckles.
All right?
Thomas asked him.
He nodded jerkily. Yeah. Oh, we should strip that bed before the blood soaks through more than it has.
Thomas helped him do it.
You've seen blokes die before, he reminded him.
I have, Collins agreed, bundling up the sheets. Never been in charge before when it happened.
Oh. It's not your fault, Thomas pointed out. They must have missed something when they operated on him. Or it was too badly hurt to begin with.
I know, Collins said. I don't know.
Thomas wished he'd sent Rollins and stayed in the wards himself. "Just think about the next thing you have to do. We'll put the stuff in the burn bin, make them up the bed again."
We should put the kettle on,"
Collins said.
"The patients will be shaken up too, seeing this."
"Good idea. Tea and cigarettes all round, and once they're settled, we'll have some too."
So they did that, and as they took the tea around, they told the patients that the poor bastard had been very badly injured when he came in, much worse than the man you were speaking to, because that was what you said, whether it was true or not. Morris and the other bloke came back just as they were finishing up the tea round, and after quick checks on their own wards, they all convened in C Block's sink room. Thomas handed round the tea, and Collins asked,
"You lads all right?"
They all nodded solemnly.
"Did the officer say what happened?"
Cadman asked. Collins shook his head.
"No, he might not know yet either," Thomas said, "but he won't mind telling you when he finds out, if you want to know."
"Thanks,"
Collins said. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders.
"I'm fine. These things happen."
You couldn't argue with that. A few hours later, Thomas was in his own block's sink room, putting some things away, when Captain Allenby came in. His jacket was unbuttoned, his tie hanging loose, and he looked like he had been up all night, which he probably had, but he usually didn't look it.
"Have you ever noticed," he said, "that it's easier when a whole lot of them die at once?"
He leaned up against the door frame.
"You don't have to think about them as people. It's just,"
he gestured,
"on to the next."
"Oh, that explains a lot, really."
"I can usually manage that, even when it's only one."
"Lucky you," said Captain Allenby.
"How do you manage that?" "I have a lot of practice not thinking about things. The trick is to think about something else. Did you find out what happened to that bloke?"
"I did,"
Allenby said, and began talking about a weakness in the something or other artery, which had given way under the pressure created by the damage to something else. Thomas didn't really try to follow it, just made occasional encouraging noises, and when Allenby finally wound down, he said,
"See? You weren't thinking about him being a person then, were you?"
"No," Allenby agreed.
"It's a good trick. I'll have to remember that one."
He tilted his head back, exposing the long, pale line of his throat.
"What else can we think about?"
It was a little obvious, but what the hell, they'd had a rough night. Thomas backed him up against the cabinet they kept the bedpans in, and kissed him. He didn't think about a little room above the Bird and Bell, Kew Gardens, a telegram boy standing at the kitchen door of Downton Abbey framed in sunlight like a saint, letters that said, I don't know if you've heard, but a ship going down, a man bleeding to death in front of his eyes, the big push, and whether or not they need to find a place to put the dozen or two new men they were getting, or if that problem would just take care of itself. He did think about the heat of a body under his, the pressure of lips on his, the scent of aftershave and hair oil, a cock pressing against his hip and his own hardening in answer, the taste of whiskey on his tongue, hands stroking down his back, a heartbeat pounding in time with his own. He also did not think about the fact that they were in a public place, the open door, the approaching dawn. Not at least until the familiar voice said,
"Son, how are you? Oh, fuck me!"
Thomas sprang away from Allenby as though he had caught fire, but of course that wasn't quick enough, not nearly quick enough. His mind raced for an explanation, but there wasn't one. There was no way to explain this away.
"I beg your fucking pardon, sir,"
said the wardmaster.
"I'd like to see Corporal Barrow when you're through with him."
Of course, Sergeant, Captain Allenby said.
"We'll just, that is,
Yeah,"
the wardmaster said and withdrew, closing the door behind him. Thomas wiped his mouth with his hand and buttoned his tunic back up. They hadn't gotten as far as opening anybody's trousers, was about all you could say for this situation. Allenby looked at him, wide-eyed.
"How bad do you suppose that is?" "I don't know,"
said Thomas. Was this, as far as the wardmaster was concerned, something you kept in the fucking family, or something you passed up the chain before the shit had time to stick?
"He likes me. Or he did. He might. I don't know."
His legs fell out from underneath him, and he was sitting on the ground.
"Fuck!"
Even if the wardmaster didn't report him, he sure as fuck wasn't going to be his golden boy anymore.
I'm sorry, Allenby said. Damn it to hell, I'm sorry.
He looked as wretched as Thomas felt.
I started it, Thomas pointed out. Not exactly.
It didn't really matter, not unless one or the other of them was going to claim the other had just suddenly started kissing him a fraction of a second before the wardmaster opened the door.
And it was a little late for that. I'd better go,
Thomas said, making a move to get up.
He's going to...
He didn't even know what the wardmaster was going to do, but it would not do any fucking good at all for him to get the idea that they were actually in here finishing up.
Probably,
Allenby said, extending a hand to help Thomas to his feet. He took it.
Thanks. I'll tell you what's happening if I can.
If he wasn't in the fucking guardhouse. The wardmaster was at least not waiting for him out in D Block. He was probably in his office, Thomas thought distantly, and headed there, feeling like a ghost as he moved through the passageways. He didn't see many people. It was too early. But the ones he did seemed like they were underwater. Or like he was. Like they or he were in a different world parallel to the real one. The wardmaster's door was half open. Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself, and knocked.
Yes.
His mouth was dry.
It's Barrow.
Come in.
Thomas did. The wardmaster was at his desk, of course, his tunic buttoned up to the throat.
Shut the fucking door.
Thomas shut the fucking door, then stood in front of the wardmaster's desk and braced up, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead.
I will ask what the fuck you were thinking because it's pretty fucking obvious you weren't.
Yes, Master Sergeant.
Do you have any fucking idea?
He shook his head.
I have put a lot of fucking work into you, and if the wrong fucking person had seen that, it would all be for fucking nothing. Do you understand that?
Startled, Thomas glanced at him. Was he saying that the wrong person hadn't seen that? The wardmaster sighed.
Sit the fuck down, son.
He was still, son? Shakily, keeping a wary eye on the wardmaster, Thomas sat down. His tone gentler, the wardmaster went on.
You have got to be more careful than that. You know that, don't you?
Thomas nodded.
I do,
He cut himself off. There was no point making excuses for himself. Even if the wardmaster was, by some miracle, angry with him for a different reason than he thought.
You didn't even shut the goddamn door,
the wardmaster reminded him.
It was very stupid of me,
Thomas agreed.
And even if you had, anybody could have walked in. Another officer, one of your lads. You want them to see that.
No, Master Sergeant.
He swallowed again.
I won't do it again.
You'd best not.
The wardmaster sighed again.
And an officer. You've got to be careful with that, son. The wrong person sees you being a little too familiar and you're in the shit, whether he suspects there's anything more to it or not.
Wait, was the wardmaster saying... Well, no, he wasn't saying, because no one said. But it would explain a hell of a lot. Normal men never liked Thomas. Especially not older ones. He hadn't noticed anything, but then hadn't been paying a lot of attention to that sort of thing. Not until just recently, anyway. He remembered being sloppy drunk on the way to the mess and the wardmaster's hand on his neck. Had that been a pass? Even in light of this new information, it didn't really seem like one. But that was the question of why he hadn't made one. Thomas knew what he looked like. All of that flashed through his mind in an instant before he turned his thought back to making some sort of coherent response to what the wardmaster had said. Cautiously, he essayed,
I have some practice with that kind of thing.
He had never forgotten, for instance, when Philip was Philip and when he was Your Grace.
I reckon you do,
the wardmaster said.
But the stakes can be pretty fucking high in the army. I once saw a bloke get 28 days FP1 for calling a Rupert by his Christian name when another Rupert was walking by.
Thomas could not entirely repress a shudder.
Yeah, figured that would put a scar into you.
He lit 2 cigarettes and handed one to Thomas, erasing any lingering doubts on that score. It didn't feel like a pass, though. Just a signal, and the wardmaster continued.
The other thing about fucking Ruperts is that no matter what you get up to They're still fucking Ruperts, especially if things go south between you. But even if not, it's always going to be more important for you to keep them happy than for them to keep you happy.
Well, of course it was.
I'm used to that too. The War Master gave him a pitying look.
I'm not saying you can't handle it, son. I'm saying maybe you don't want to.
Oh. You never quite thought of it that way before.
You stick to your own kind, it can be harder to find an opportunity, but you don't risk ending up with some bugger thinking he owns you.
That wasn't a promise Thomas had ever had. The problem he had was that none of them ever wanted to own him.
Not really.
But then again, he wasn't sure he'd have liked it if they had. We don't have the basis of a master-servant relationship, His Grace Philip had said, and perhaps he hadn't just been talking about Thomas being his valet.
So that's my piece on the subject,
the Ward Master said.
But it's not my business what you do, unless you make it my business.
I understand,
Thomas said. He wasn't forbidding him to see Captain Allenby. Not that he actually could, except in the ways that he absolutely could. But he had damn well best not get caught again.
Good. Now, what I was actually looking for you for was to see how Collins was handling that poor bugger bleeding to death on his watch.
Right. Thomas put his mind back on the job.
He was a bit shaken up, but he kept it together.
They talked about that for a few minutes, and then the ward master dismissed him back to his wards. They still had a couple of hours left before the day shift came on. When he got back, Rollins was at the desk in Thomas's ward. Good. He hadn't thought about getting someone to keep an eye on things while he was gone. Among other things he hadn't thought about.
Everything all right?
He asked Rollins. He nodded.
I left Plank on his own. Told him to yell if he needed me.
Thomas had put Plank and Rollins together in the largest ward on his block, men's sick.
The captain said you had to go and see the wardmaster? Yeah. He wanted to know how Collins was holding up. Can you stay here another minute? I have a question for the captain too.
Rollins said that he could, so Thomas went to the little cupboard where the M.O. on night call slept. He found Allenby sitting on the edge of his bunk, his tie on straight and his jacket buttoned.
Barrow?
He said, looking behind him.
It's all right, Thomas said. Tore a strip out of me for being so careless about it, but that's it.
Oh, thank God, Allenby said, his shoulders slumping in relief. Thomas nodded.
I'd better get back, he said, but I figured you'd want to know.
I did.
Thanks.
And that, astonishingly, by the grace of God and the wardmaster, was that. For the next couple of nights, Captain Allenby kept his distance. Thomas felt a tinge of regret over that, but not enough to make a move. And then he was abruptly taken off nights and put on roster as the wardmaster's clerk. He vaguely remembered the wardmaster saying something about that before they'd gone to the CCS, but he was looking sideways at the timing. On the first day, the wardmaster asked that question too, saying,
In case you were fucking wondering, this was in the works already, but I can't say I mind having you where I can keep an eye on you.
That did almost sound like a pass, or at least the prelude to one, but nothing came of it. Thomas wasn't sure whether he wanted it to or not. He didn't usually go for older men, not for anyone quite as ostentatiously uncouth as the wardmaster was, but the idea wasn't without a certain appeal. He had big hands. Thomas liked that. He wasn't entirely sure whether to imagine them holding him down or stroking his hair. Either way, the wardmaster would say, "Fuck, son," either more roughly or more tenderly than he'd ever say it in real life. And either way, Thomas wouldn't have to make any fucking decisions about it, about where or when or whether it was safe, because the wardmaster would take care of all that. But he only allowed himself to think about it at night in the barn, where he was alone because everybody else was still on night duty, and even then, not very often. During the day, the wardmaster was the same as he'd always been, sharp as a whip and crude as a bag of bricks, and fond of Thomas in a hands-off sort of way. Thomas could barely keep up with how much he was learning about how the dressing station ran, how the army ran, how to work with officers, or work around them, and how to tell which one was called for. The wardmaster knew almost everything that went on at the station, both because he had a network of informants, which Thomas had long suspected he must, and because he took in everything and forgot nothing. It wasn't unusual for a walk around the station grounds to result in a list of half a dozen things that required looking into in one way or another, all completely unrelated, both to one another and to the purpose of the trip. One day, inside of a single minute, he noticed one of the motor ambulances making a funny noise, windows on Block A men's surgical not open when they should have been, and an unusual accumulation of French peasants in the kitchen yard. On the other hand, while the wardmaster seemed to have in his head a constantly updating encyclopedia of the station's personnel, patients, equipment, and resources, he couldn't keep track of pieces of paper to save his life. His desk had always looked fairly neat when Thomas saw it, but that turned out to be because he was in the habit of sweeping piles of clutter into a drawer for his clerk to sort out later. He wasn't the sloppy pack rat that Biggs had been. If something was on his desk or in his drawer, you could be sure it was important, but sometimes it was a job to figure out how. One of Thomas's main duties as his clerk was to tag along when he met with officers and hand him various forms and files when he started talking about them. He also had very little patience for writing, though he could manage a neat hand when he bothered, and handled most of his correspondence by pacing up and down his office telling Thomas what to write down. Another of Thomas's duties at meetings was to take notes, not because the wardmaster ever referred to them or even asked Thomas to do so, but because, as the wardmaster said,
"The fucking Ruperts expect you to."
So Thomas spent a lot of time sitting across from Major Thwaite's adjutant, while the wardmaster sat across from Major Thwaite, both of them taking notes and supplying their superiors with files. Occasionally, when something reminded him of Rouse usually, he wondered how much more Lieutenant What's-His-Name was getting paid than he was for them to do the same job. That probably wasn't thinking big enough for Rouse, though. He'd want to know why the wardmaster wasn't a general.
Or Prime Minister!
It was in that way that Thomas was there when the decision about new corporals, they were getting 2 new sections, was made. Despite what the wardmaster had said on the subject, he was not, strictly speaking, taking the new corporals. What he was doing was making recommendations to the chief medical officer. Thomas was given to understand that the wardmaster had a freer hand when it came to the enlisted men than was strictly usual, but as he said,
"You've got to give them their own fucking way sometimes."
He also said, as they walked across the grounds to the meeting,
"You're gonna want to watch this."
He was right. The wardmaster started with Manning, whom the brass also liked, though not as much as they liked Applegate, from a position of cautious agreement, citing Manning's drive and ambition and the speed with which he'd picked up on the paperwork and other extra duties of a night shift corporal, but also mentioning a few reservations, most importantly the allegation, which Thomas thought was probably true, that he had played favorites when it came to the men under him, assigning lighter work to the 2 from his own section than the outsiders and allowing them longer and more frequent breaks. He then permitted Major Thwaite to convince him that those missteps were typical of a young and inexperienced NCO giving command over a group which included his friends, and that they could be remedied with instruction and supervision. Thomas filled in Manning's name on the first set of promotion paperwork, and Thwaite signed it. Then they started talking about poor Applegate. It was fairly hard to watch as the wardmaster dragged up every mistake he'd made, including his struggles with paperwork, about which the wardmaster wasn't in much of a position to cast stones, and pointed out the potential ramification of such errors. He lingered darkly on the time Applegate forgot to record pulses and temperatures, sliding over the important detail that Applegate had, in fact, taken them, and presumably would have noticed if there had been anything alarming in them, which Thomas knew the wardmaster did understand because they had talked about it. Thomas would have hated him a little for it, but once he was done tearing Applegate down, the wardmaster went on to talk about the good reports he'd gotten from the NCOs Applegate had worked under on various wards, that he was a hard worker and a cheerful sort to have around, gentle with the patients, and hated to let anyone down.
"We've not been doing him a kindness search to promote him past what he's good at. And he's just a lad. We could take another look at him later on, depending."
"Well," said Major Thwaite, "if you feel that strongly about it, I take it you have someone else to suggest."
After that, Colin's promotion sailed through with little difficulty. They went back to the office where the wardmaster reports and drinks. It was afternoon, and said,
"So, son, what'd you notice?"
Thomas took his glass and thought carefully. "I didn't realize you knew about all of those things Applegate got wrong.
I had Wilkes and Robertson reported to me.
He explained. Those were the two men from outside the section that Applegate had in his block.
They didn't much want to do it. They liked the lad, but they didn't think he'd be too fucking happy being promoted anyway. What else?
Well, you talked about Applegate doing fairly well as an orderly. That seemed important, but I'm not sure why. Was it just so it would feel less...
It was like I was stabbing one of my own lads in the back. Not quite. I didn't like that much either, though. Or letting him make that many mistakes. I can think of about half a dozen ways off the top of my head we could have propped him up a bit if that had been the fucking point.
He lit a cigarette.
But the reason I had to say it to himself instead of dealing with my conscience on my own fucking time is so that if Applegate comes to the Major's attention again, he isn't thinking of him as just a fuck-up. That can make a difference if he gets into some kind of trouble or anything.
I see.
That was an area where Thomas could stand to learn from the Wardmaster's example. He wasn't bad at thinking through the angles once a problem had cropped up, but he had a hard time seeing them coming.
What about Manning? Did you see what I did with him?
Thomas had seen something, but it was almost too obvious to point out.
Well, you brought him up first, so you could let the Major win one.
He wondered if there was something else he'd missed.
Yeah,
said the Wardmaster, and waited.
I'll give you a hint. I wanted him to miss it too.
Thomas lit a cigarette, chewing it over. Was there something about Manning, some disqualification, that the Wardmaster had omitted to mention? He couldn't think of anything. Was there something about Collins he hadn't mentioned? But the Wardmaster had asked if Thomas saw what he did with Manning, and he never compared. And they never compared Manning and Collins.
Oh. You had him sign Manning's before you started talking about the other two because you didn't want him choosing between Manning and Collins.
Good lad,
the Wardmaster said, topping up both their drinks.
There wasn't too much of a chance the Major'd pick Applegate over Collins once he had the facts in front of him. But if he'd been looking at 3 men for 2 slots, he just might have taken it into his own head that it was fair enough if he picked one over my objections and let me pick the other. And that would put me in a tight fucking spot because Collins is a damn sight better than Manning. Really, nice fucking catch on that one. But Manning might hit the ceiling if Applegate got the nod and he didn't, and it would be hard to fucking blame him.
It would be. He had some questions when it was me and not him,
Thomas admitted.
It wouldn't have been him, then. Even if you'd never been born, he's going to need fucking watching as he settles in.
The Wardmaster took a drink and added,
Not by you, either. I mean, help them if they ask, like on wards, and let me or Jessup know if they're in trouble, but I'll tap a sergeant to keep an eye on each of them.
Thomas nodded, feeling obscurely jealous. He hadn't had a sergeant keeping an eye on him. Sergeant Winchester didn't count.
You have me and Jessup,
the Wardmaster added. Oh, that was right. He did, didn't he?
Jessup's been a lance sergeant at least a dozen times. He just doesn't like it.
I wondered about that,
Thomas said. It did seem a little strange that they had the same rank when Jessup had probably gone into the army before Thomas was born. Or at least not long after.
Luckily, we aren't hemorrhaging NCOs the way the fighting units are. There hasn't been much pressure to put him up further than he wants to go.
6th of April, 1916. Dear Anna, thank you for the parcel. I'm sorry I haven't written since we got back to the 47th. I have been very busy working as the Wardmaster's clerk. I am not sure when the man sleeps. I am finished with that now, but I won't have much of a respite because we have some new men coming and my section will be training them. My old section, I should say. As of tomorrow, when the new men turn up, we will be broken up into 3, each with 4 of us and 8 of the new blokes. We are all staying in our old billet, however. As I wrote to Miss Hughes, it has been fixed up and very well, too. The new fellows will be sleeping in a tent on the station grounds, which is certainly more convenient, but we have gotten used to being out where no one bothers us if we're off duty. You can see a bit of our barn in the enclosed photograph. Rollins, one of my billet mates, got a vest pocket camera for his birthday and has been bothering us with it all week. You will also see the newest addition to our section. His name is either Pumpkin, Tiger, or Mittens, depending on who you ask. Theoretically, he is supposed to help us with our mouse problem, which has not abated, but at present he is too busy stuffing himself on sardines and chicken, as well as posing for photographs to do very much about it. He is Rollins' favorite subject. I expect it is a complete accident that I am in the photograph at all. I wouldn't be surprised if William got his call-up soon. He really shouldn't be in any hurry, in my opinion. I don't know exactly what the army has planned, and I wouldn't be allowed to talk about it if I did. But it's not exactly a secret that there's something in the works. Early summer is my best guess, so if he's lucky, he might still be in training when it goes off. As far as parcels go, we could use some more tea. Some of the fellows are having their people send tins of sardines for what's-his-name, but I don't think he needs them. He is already heavy enough when he lands on your kidneys while you're trying to sleep. Thomas. Looking at the photograph, Anna had to cover her mouth with her hand to stifle a giggle. It showed Thomas sitting outside in a battered armchair with one ankle propped up on the opposite knee reading a newspaper. Perched on his shoulder like a pirate's parrot was a fluffy tabby kitten, an orange tabby presumably given the name. It was peering at the newspaper and extending one white-tipped paw as though pointing out something on the page.
What is it?
Mr. Bates asked. They were in the servants' hall table before tea. She handed him the photograph. "They got a kitten for their billets," she explained. "Thomas is pretending he doesn't like it."
Of course he is,
Mr. Bates said. "He looks well, though, don't you think?" Anna asked. She had been worrying about him, as they'd barely heard from him since Christmas.
He does,
Mr. Bates agreed.
and he really is a corporal,
He added.
You could see his stripes in the photograph.
Did you think he was lying about it?
Anna asked.
I wouldn't put it past him.
Anna decided not to argue the point.
"I shall have to show it to Miss Hughes."
She, being privy to the description of Thomas as a small angry kitten, would certainly see the humor in it. Her smile faded as she remembered where that description had come from.
What's wrong?
Mr. Bates asked. She shook her head.
"I just realized that if Mr. Fitzroy were alive, Thomas would have sent this to him. He'd have liked it, I think."